There's a horse at a facility I read about in a study, privately owned, trained for years by the same person, and when researchers ran a specific test separating the horse from both its owner and a complete stranger, then bringing each person back, the horse showed more interest in the stranger, more physical contact, more proximity seeking, more of the behaviors that researchers use to measure attachment and trust, not the owner, the stranger. And the researchers didn't treat this as a fluke. They found it across multiple horses, in multiple studies. Enough times that it's now an established pattern in equine science. Horses trained a certain way consistently show more affiliation toward strangers. Now, before you immediately think about your own horse, let me tell you what was actually different about those horses. Because the answer isn't that horses don't form bonds with their owners. It isn't that familiarity breeds some kind of distance. It's something specific, something that happens in training that most people have never been told about. And once you understand it, you'll probably recognize it. There's a concept behind all of this that explains not just the stranger finding, but also the spooky horse, the resistant horse, the horse that goes better for someone else at the yard, and the one that seems to genuinely not want to be caught. It's one concept, and it reframes all of those things completely. Here's something worth clearing up first, because trust is a word that gets used around horses in a way that's almost entirely backwards. Most people, when they talk about a horse trusting them, are describing something the horse does. The horse stands quietly. The horse comes when called. The horse doesn't spook as much with me. And so we say, my horse trusts me. But from the horse's perspective, trust isn't about behavior. It's about prediction. A horse trusts you when they can accurately predict what you're going to do next, when the signals you give are consistent, clear, and when you follow through on them in a way that makes sense to them, when being near you means something reliable is going to happen, not necessarily something pleasant, but something they can anticipate and respond to without anxiety. Unpredictability is the thing horses find most stressful, not difficulty, not challenge, unpredictability. A horse that knows a hard thing is coming can prepare for it. A horse that doesn't know what's coming, that's the horse that's always tense, always on edge, always half a second from reacting to something you didn't notice. And here's the uncomfortable implication of that. A stranger, someone the horse has never met, is actually lower threat than an owner with inconsistent signals. Because a stranger hasn't yet done anything unpredictable. They haven't yet broken a pattern. They arrive as a blank page. And horses, when they encounter a blank page, often approach with more curiosity than wariness, whereas the owner, in some cases, arrives with a history, a pattern that sometimes holds and sometimes doesn't. Signals that mean one thing on a calm day and something different when the owner is rushed, stressed, or frustrated. And the horse has filed all of that. The study I mentioned at the start looked at 26 privately owned horses. Researchers used a modified version of something called the strange situation, procedure originally designed to study attachment in human infants and their caregivers. They adapted it for horses. The horse was introduced to both its owner and a stranger, then separated from each person in turn, then reunited. They measured heart rate, physical proximity, and contact-seeking behavior throughout. And what they found is that horses broadly treated both the owner and the stranger as what researchers call a safe haven, meaning they found human presence comforting regardless of familiarity. But then they split the horses by training method. The owners had reported how they trained positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or a mix, and that's where the difference appeared. Horses trained with positive reinforcement, reward-based interactions spent significantly more time seeking proximity to the stranger, more physical contact, more closeness, more of the behaviors associated with trust and social bonding. Not less than the owner, more than the other horses. With the stranger, researchers interpreted this not as a failure of the owner bond, but as evidence that positive reinforcement trained. Horses had generalized their positive associations. The owner had taught them that humans, as a category, were worth approaching. So they approached them. But for horses trained primarily through pressure and release, negative reinforcement, the associations were more conditional, more specific to what had happened with specific people in specific contexts. The trust, where it existed, was narrower, more earned in the moment, less general. And here's the thing that I found genuinely striking about this. It's not that negative reinforcement doesn't work. The research is clear. The difference isn't in what they learn. It's in who they become on the other side of that learning. There's a second piece of research that adds something important. Horses just like new things, natural curiosity. But that's not quite what's going on. Researcher Sankey found that training via negative reinforcement was associated with an increased emotional state, measurable through heart rate and behavioral indicators. These horses also sought less contact with people after training, not just during, after. The emotional residue changed how they oriented toward humans. The opposite was true for positive reinforcement. Horses showed increased interest in humans after training, including unfamiliar ones. This effect was visible after just 5 3-minute sessions, and it was still measurable 5 months later. 5 sessions, 5 months of effect. The way you interact with your horse during training isn't just teaching them a behavior, it's shaping their general orientation. Toward people, the emotional climate of those sessions becomes their baseline expectation for what human contact means. If the baseline is humans bring pressure that gets released when I do the right thing, then every new human they meet inherits that frame. They're waiting to see what the pressure is going to be, what they need to do to make it stop. If the baseline is, humans sometimes bring good things and interactions tend to be worth having, then every new human they meet gets the benefit. The stranger walks in, and the horse's working hypothesis is, this might be interesting. You are not just training behaviors, you are training a worldview. Now, here's the part that I think is the most useful and the most confronting, depending on what your relationship looks like. Because none of this is about positive versus negative reinforcement. In the technical training sense, that conversation gets complicated quickly. There are horse people who will argue about it for hours. This is about something simpler and more immediate. It's about whether your horse, on most days, can predict what you're going to do. Not whether you're kind, not whether you love them. Whether you're legible to them. A horse that goes better for someone else isn't rejecting you. A horse that's hard to catch isn't being difficult. A horse that tenses when you put your foot in the stirrup isn't misbehaving. They're responding to a history of signals. Signals that didn't always mean what they were supposed to mean. Pressure that didn't release when expected. Requests that changed before they could respond to them. Days when the same movement meant one thing, and other days something else entirely. Because your emotional state was different, and that bled through into your aids whether you intended it to or not. The stranger doesn't have that history yet. The stranger is clear. The stranger, from your horse's perspective, is actually easier to read because there's no accumulated ambiguity to navigate. That's not a reason to feel bad about it. It's a reason to ask a different question than most people ask. Not, why doesn't my horse trust me? But, what am I asking them to predict that I'm not actually making predictable? Here's the practical thing that comes out of all of this. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not prescribing a training method. That's not what this channel is about. What the research points toward is something more fundamental than technique. Horses generalize from you to humans in general. The emotional texture of your interactions with them becomes their baseline assumption for what human contact means, which means that the most important thing you can do isn't any specific training exercise. It's making the cost of interacting with you low, consistently. Not just on good days. Low cost doesn't mean no demands. It doesn't mean only pleasant interactions. Horses in the wild navigate complex social hierarchies with constant demands and negotiations. That's not the problem. The problem is the horse that doesn't know what the demand is going to be until it's already been applied. The horse that has learned that human presence means incoming pressure of unknown origin at unknown timing for unknown duration. Your horse's relationship with you changes their relationship with the whole world. That's either a weight you carry around because it feels like pressure, or it's the most compelling reason. I know to take the quality of those ordinary, unremarkable, stable moments seriously. We started with a horse choosing a stranger over its owner, not because the owner was a bad person, not because the bond wasn't real, but because of what the training history had taught that horse to expect from human contact and how that expectation colored every new human they met. The same dynamic explains the horse that goes better for someone else, the one that's hard to catch, the one that checks out in a session, even though nothing obviously went wrong. They're not being difficult. They're being accurate. And the stranger, the blank page, with no history, no accumulated ambiguity, no pattern that might or might not hold, is genuinely easier to read. At least for now, until they become familiar to. until they also build a history. Which means the question isn't whether your horse trusts strangers. The question is, what kind of familiar do you want to become? The next video in this series goes somewhere I wasn't expecting when I started researching this. Because there's a specific behavior horses do that most owners interpret as affection, and the science says it's actually something else, entirely. Something that tells you more about the state of the relationship than any other single signal. I looked into it properly, and the findings are genuinely not what I expected. I'll see you there. Subscribe if you want to catch that one when it drops. And drop a comment below. Has your horse ever seemed more comfortable with a stranger than with you? Even briefly. What was happening at the time? I think the answers to that are going to be very honest and very interesting.